there is a question that haunts the thoughtful person in moments of quiet reflection. Am I truly myself, or am I the person I learned to be? When we look at our lives, at the patterns we repeat, at the roles we inhabit, at the ways we present ourselves to the world, we may notice something unsettling. Much of what we call our personality, our character, our self, was not chosen freely. It was constructed, piece by piece, in response to the demands and dangers of our early environment. We became who we needed to be in order to survive. And now, decades later, we continue to be that person, even though the original threat has long since passed. This is the paradox of the false self. It was necessary for survival, and yet it prevents us from truly living. It protected us as children, and yet it imprisons us as adults. It earned us love and acceptance, and yet it keeps us from being genuinely known. The false self is both our salvation and our cage. And the most troubling aspect is that we do not recognize it as false. We believe it is who we are. We have identified with the adaptation so completely that we cannot distinguish it from our authentic being. When we speak of the false self in depth psychology, we are speaking about a construct that the ego creates in response to an environment that cannot accept the child's true nature. Every child is born with a particular essence, a unique constellation of temperament, needs, desires, sensitivities. This is what we might call the true self, the authentic core. But this true self exists in relationship with caregivers who have their own needs, their own limitations, their own unresolved psychological material. And when the true self of the child conflicts with the needs or capacities of the caregivers, the child faces an impossible dilemma. The child cannot survive without the caregivers. The dependency is absolute. The child needs food, shelter, protection, and perhaps most critically, emotional attunement and love. Without these, the child will literally die or suffer developmental damage so severe that it amounts to psychological death. And so when the child discovers that certain aspects of their true self threaten the connection with the caregivers, when expressing their authentic nature results in rejection, punishment, or emotional abandonment, the child must make a choice. But it is not really a choice. It is a survival necessity. The child must adapt. And this is where the false self begins to form. The child learns which aspects of themselves are acceptable and which are dangerous. They learn what brings approval and what brings punishment. They learn which emotions are welcomed and which must be hidden. They learn which needs can be expressed and which must be denied. And gradually, systematically, unconsciously, they begin to split themselves. The acceptable parts are emphasized, developed, presented to the world. The unacceptable parts are suppressed, denied, pushed into the unconscious. A false self emerges that conforms to the requirements of the environment, while the true self goes into hiding. Let me give you a concrete example. Consider a child who is born highly sensitive, emotionally expressive, deeply feeling. This is their nature. But they are born into a family where emotions are seen as weakness, where the parents are uncomfortable with feelings and respond to the child's emotional expressions with irritation or dismissal. The child cries and is told to stop crying. The child expresses fear and is told there is nothing to be afraid of. The child expresses joy and is told to calm down. The message is clear. Your emotional nature is not acceptable here. And so the child adapts. They learn to suppress their feelings. They learn to present a calm, controlled exterior. They develop a false self that is rational, composed, unemotional. And this false self works. It earns them acceptance. It reduces conflict. It makes the environment safer. But the true self, the sensitive and feeling self, does not disappear. It goes into the shadow, into the unconscious. And there it remains, waiting, longing to be expressed, creating symptoms and disturbances that the person cannot understand because they have identified completely with the false self. As an adult, this person may present themselves as highly rational, perhaps even priding themselves on not being emotional. They may become a scientist, an engineer, a professional, where emotions are not required. They may describe themselves as logical, analytical, objective, and they genuinely believe this is who they are. But beneath this false self, the true self persists. The sensitivity is still there. The emotional depth is still there. But it has no outlet, no expression. And so it manifests in other ways. Perhaps through depression, which is often emotion that has been turned inward and frozen. Perhaps through psychosomatic symptoms, the body expressing what the mind cannot acknowledge. Perhaps through sudden overwhelming emotions that break through the rational facade in moments of stress, leaving the person confused and frightened by their own reactions. Or consider a different example. A child who is naturally assertive, strong-willed, full of vitality and initiative, but they are born into a family that cannot tolerate this energy. Perhaps the parents are authoritarian and demand obedience. Perhaps there is a sick sibling who requires all the attention and the healthy child is expected to be invisible and undemanding. Perhaps the family system is chaotic and the child's assertiveness is seen as adding to the chaos. For whatever reason, the child's natural vitality is experienced as a threat or a burden, and so the child learns to suppress it. They learn to be compliant, passive, accommodating. They learn to anticipate others' needs and defer to them. They develop a false self that is gentle, undemanding, always putting others first. And this false self earns them acceptance and reduces conflict. But the true self, the vital and assertive self, goes into the shadow. And as an adult, this person may be completely identified with being accommodating. They may describe themselves as easygoing, flexible, not needing much. They may genuinely believe they prefer to let others make decisions, that they do not mind putting their own desires aside. But beneath this false self, there is a growing resentment, a sense of being unseen and unimportant, a vitality that has nowhere to go. And this manifests in various ways. Perhaps in passive-aggressive behavior, the suppressed assertiveness leaking out in indirect expressions of resistance. Perhaps in chronic fatigue, the life force being turned against itself. Perhaps in sudden outbursts of anger that seem disproportionate to the situation, the accumulated pressure of decades of suppression finally breaking through. Perhaps in a vague sense of emptiness, of going through the motions of life without genuine engagement, because the false self can only perform while the true self is what actually lives. These examples illustrate a fundamental principle. The false self is constructed through the suppression of the true self. It is built from what is acceptable rather than from what is authentic. And because this process begins in early childhood, before the development of conscious memory and critical thinking, it happens unconsciously. The child does not decide to create a false self. The process is automatic, driven by the survival necessity of maintaining attachment to the caregivers. Now we must understand the mechanisms through which the false self is constructed and maintained. The primary mechanism is dissociation. This is the process by which aspects of experience are split off from consciousness, isolated from the main personality structure. When a child experiences their authentic self being rejected repeatedly, when expressing their true nature consistently results in pain or abandonment, the psyche protects itself by dissociating that aspect of self. It is not that the child consciously decides to pretend to be someone else. It is that the psyche automatically walls off the dangerous authentic self and creates a safer adapted self to interact with the environment. This dissociation is a brilliant survival mechanism in childhood. It allows the child to maintain necessary relationships while protecting the core self from being completely annihilated. But it has profound consequences. The dissociated aspects do not integrate into the developing personality. They remain split off, forming what we call the shadow. Meanwhile, the false self, which is built from compliance and adaptation rather than from authentic being, becomes the conscious identity. Another mechanism is identification with the aggressor. This occurs when the child internalizes the critical or rejecting voice of the caregiver and makes it their own. The child who is constantly criticized for being emotional begins to criticize themselves for having feelings. The child who is shamed for their needs begins to shame themselves for wanting anything. The child who is punished for their vitality begins to police their own energy. The external rejection becomes internalized, becomes part of the superego, the harsh inner judge that enforces the suppression of the true self and the maintenance of the false self. This internalized critical voice is often not recognized as having external origins. The adult experiences it as their own judgment, their own values, their own standards. They do not realize they are enforcing upon themselves the same rejection they experienced from their caregivers. And this internalized rejection is often more severe than anything the caregivers actually said or did, because the psyche amplifies it, makes it absolute, turns it into a fundamental judgment about the worth and acceptability of the self. A third mechanism is what we might call preemptive adaptation. The child becomes hypervigilant to the needs and moods of the caregivers, constantly scanning the environment for signs of danger, constantly adjusting their behavior to maintain safety. This develops into what is sometimes called a false self that is oriented entirely toward others, toward reading them, pleasing them, managing them. The child learns to become what is needed rather than to be who they are. And this pattern continues into adulthood, where the person is always performing, always adapting, always trying to figure out what others want and provide it, never in contact with their own authentic desires and feelings. This preemptive adaptation creates a particular type of false self that is highly attuned to external cues, but completely disconnected from internal experience. The person can accurately read a room, can sense what others are feeling, can adjust their presentation to fit different contexts. But if you ask them what they themselves want or feel, they do not know. They have spent so much energy and attention on the external world that the internal world has become foreign to them. Now we must speak of the types of childhood environments that necessitate the creation of a false self. The most obvious is the overtly abusive or neglectful environment. When a child is subjected to violence, to severe criticism, to emotional coldness, to unpredictable rage, the need to create a false self is clear. The child must become whatever will minimize the abuse, whatever will maximize safety. They must learn to be invisible, or perfectly compliant, or hypervigilant, or whatever adaptation offers the best chance of survival. But the false self is not created only in overtly traumatic environments. It can be created in what appear to be normal or even loving families, if those families cannot accept certain aspects of the child's true nature. A family that is highly intellectual may not be able to accept a child who is emotional or artistic. A family that values achievement may not be able to accept a child who is contemplative or unmotivated by conventional success. A family that requires harmony may not be able to accept a child who is confrontational or questioning. In these cases, the parents may genuinely love the child, may want the best for them, may believe they are providing a good environment. But if they cannot accept fundamental aspects of who the child actually is, if they respond to the child's authentic nature with disappointment or anxiety or attempts to change them, the child will still need to create a false self. The message does not have to be delivered through abuse. It can be delivered through subtle disappointment, through anxious overconcern, through conditional approval. The child learns, I am acceptable when I am like this, unacceptable when I am like that. And the false self is constructed accordingly. There is also what we might call the parentified child, where the child is forced to take care of the emotional needs of the parents. This occurs when parents are immature, overwhelmed, or emotionally needy, and they look to the child to provide care, stability, or emotional regulation. The child learns that their role is to be the parent rather than to be the child. They develop a false self that is mature, responsible, caretaking, while their own childhood needs, their own dependency, their own right to be cared for, goes into the shadow. As adults, these parentified children often appear exceptionally mature and capable. They are the ones others turn to in crisis. They are the ones who handle responsibility well. But beneath this false self of maturity is a child who never got to be a child, whose needs were never met, who is exhausted from decades of caretaking, and who desperately needs someone to take care of them for once. But they cannot acknowledge this need without threatening the entire structure of their identity. Another environment that creates the false self is one where the parents project their own unlived life onto the child. The parent who wanted to be a musician but could not might push the child into music, regardless of the child's actual interests or talents. The parent who values athletic achievement might demand that the child excel in sports. The parent who has particular ambitions or dreams lives them through the child. In these situations, the child develops a false self that embodies the parent's desires rather than their own. They may even achieve great success in the projected domain, but it is hollow because it is not authentically theirs. I knew a man once who became a surgeon because his father was a surgeon and his grandfather was a surgeon. It was simply assumed he would follow this path. And he was good at it. He was skilled, respected, successful by all external measures. But he came to analysis in his 40s consumed by a depression he could not understand. He had everything he was supposed to want, and yet he felt nothing. Through the work, we discovered that his true passion had always been music. As a child, he had loved to play piano, would lose himself for hours in the sound and feeling of it. But music was not valued in his family. It was seen as a hobby at best, a distraction from serious pursuits. And so he abandoned it, suppressed that part of himself, and became the surgeon he was supposed to be. The false self succeeded brilliantly. The true self atrophied in the shadow. Now let us speak of what happens when the false self is carried into adulthood. The primary consequence is that the person lives a life that is not truly their own. They have a career that was chosen to please parents or to fit an image rather than from genuine interest. They have relationships that are based on what they think they should want rather than on authentic desire. They present a personality to the world that is acceptable but not real. And beneath all of this, there is a growing sense of emptiness, of going through the motions, of living someone else's life. This emptiness is often what brings people into therapy or into a psychological crisis. They have achieved what they were supposed to achieve. They have become who they were supposed to become, and yet they feel nothing. Or worse, they feel a profound despair, a sense that life is meaningless, that they have wasted years living inauthentically. This is the true self crying out from the shadow, demanding to be acknowledged, creating symptoms that cannot be ignored. The symptoms of the false self are varied. Depression is common because the life force is being channeled into maintaining an adaptation rather than into genuine living. Anxiety is common because there is always the fear of being discovered, of the mask slipping, of the true self breaking through in ways that will lead to rejection. Psychosomatic illness is common because the body expresses what the mind cannot acknowledge. Addiction is common because substances or behaviors can temporarily quiet the inner voice that knows something is fundamentally wrong. There are also relationship difficulties. The person with a false self cannot form genuine, intimate connections because intimacy requires authenticity. They can have relationships, but these relationships are based on the false self, on the persona that is presented. The partner knows the adaptation but not the person. And the person themselves feels unseen, unknown, fundamentally alone even when surrounded by people. They long for connection but cannot allow themselves to be truly vulnerable, because vulnerability would expose the true self, which they believe is unacceptable. The false self also creates a particular relationship to success and failure. Often, people with a strong false self are quite successful in conventional terms. The false self was created to achieve acceptance and approval, and it becomes very good at this. They may excel in their careers, may appear confident and capable, may have all the external markers of success. But the success feels empty because it belongs to the false self rather than to the true self. It is someone else's achievement, not their own. Conversely, when failure occurs, it can be devastating because the false self's entire reason for existence is to achieve approval and avoid rejection. Failure threatens the whole structure. The person may fall apart completely, may experience profound shame, may become suicidal, because without the false self and its achievements, they do not know who they are. The true self has been so long denied that they have no connection to it, no sense of inherent worth apart from their performance. There is also what we might call the existential crisis of the false self. This typically occurs in midlife when the person has spent decades building a life based on the false self and suddenly confronts the question, is this all there is? They have the career, the family, the house, all the things they were supposed to want, and they feel dead inside. They realize they have been performing their life rather than living it. And this realization can be shattering. This is what is often called the midlife crisis, though it is not really about age. It is about the collision between the false self that has been constructed and the true self that has been suppressed. The true self, which has been patient for decades, finally demands acknowledgement. It creates symptoms, disruptions, dissatisfactions that cannot be rationalized away. It forces the question, who am I really beneath all the roles and performances? Now we must speak of the process of recognizing and dismantling the false self, which is essential to the work of individuation. This process usually begins with a crisis, because the ego will not voluntarily give up the false self. The false self has been the survival strategy for decades. It has worked in the sense that it has maintained relationships and achieved a functional life. To question it feels like questioning everything, like losing the ground beneath one's feet. And so the recognition of the false self usually comes when it stops working, when it can no longer be maintained, when the symptoms become too severe to ignore. The crisis might be a breakdown, a moment when the false self simply cannot be performed anymore. Perhaps a person who has always been strong and capable suddenly finds themselves unable to get out of bed, unable to maintain the facade. Perhaps a person who has always been accommodating suddenly explodes in rage. Perhaps a person who has always been rational is overwhelmed by emotions they cannot control. These breakdowns are actually breakthroughs, opportunities for the true self to emerge from the shadow. The crisis might also be a life transition that makes the false self obsolete. The person who built their false self around being a successful professional retires and loses their identity. The person who built their false self around being needed by others watches their children leave home and has no role left to play. The person who built their false self around youth and beauty ages and can no longer maintain the image. In these transitions, the inadequacy of the false self becomes apparent, and there is the possibility of discovering who one actually is beneath the adaptation. The recognition of the false self is painful and disorienting. It requires acknowledging that much of what one believed about oneself is not true, that the life one has been living is not fully one's own, that decades have been spent in adaptation rather than in authentic being. This brings grief, anger, sometimes a sense of having been betrayed, though the betrayal was one's own, an unconscious necessity of childhood that has continued far beyond its usefulness. But the recognition also brings the possibility of change, of reclaiming the true self, of beginning to live authentically. This requires a process of deep excavation, of exploring the shadow, of discovering what was suppressed in the construction of the false self. It requires feeling the feelings that were not allowed, expressing the needs that were denied, developing the aspects of self that were rejected. It requires, in essence, a second childhood, a reclaiming of what was lost the first time around. This is not a quick or easy process. The false self has been in place for decades. It has become the structure of the personality, the familiar way of being. To dismantle it is to experience chaos, uncertainty, vulnerability. The person does not know who they will be without the false self. They may fear they will be nothing, that without the adaptation there is no self at all. This fear is understandable but unfounded. The true self is there, waiting, though it may be fragile and undeveloped from decades of neglect. The process of reclaiming the true self requires therapy or analysis, or some form of deep, introspective work. It requires a relationship with someone who can see the true self beneath the false self, who can reflect it back, who can provide the acceptance that the original caregivers could not provide. In the safety of this relationship, the true self can begin to emerge, tentatively at first, testing whether it is safe to be authentic, gradually gaining strength and confidence as it discovers that authentic expression does not lead to annihilation. The therapeutic relationship provides what the British analyst Winnicott called a holding environment, a space where the person can regress to the developmental stage where the false self was created, and this time have a different experience. This time, the authentic self can be expressed and be met with acceptance rather than rejection. This time, the person can discover that they are lovable as they actually are, not only as they learn to present themselves. The process also requires exploring one's history, understanding the family dynamics that necessitated the false self, seeing with compassion the impossible situation the child was in, recognizing that the adaptation was necessary and even brilliant in its way, but that it is no longer necessary. The adult has resources the child did not have. The adult can leave situations that require false self-adaptation. The adult can choose relationships that accept authentic being. The adult can, with effort and courage, live differently. This historical exploration is not about blaming the parents. Most parents do the best they can with their own limitations and their own unresolved trauma. The point is not to assign fault, but to understand what happened, to see clearly the dynamics that created the false self, so that these dynamics can be brought into consciousness and changed. Understanding breaks the spell of the unconscious repetition. As the true self is reclaimed, the person begins to change in fundamental ways. They may make different career choices, choosing work that genuinely interests them rather than work that earns approval. They may end relationships that require constant performance and seek relationships where they can be genuinely known. They may develop interests and pursuits that were always in the shadow, aspects of themselves that were never given space to develop. They may find that they are quite different from who they thought they were, that preferences they believed were their own were actually part of the false self. This reclamation is both liberating and terrifying. It is liberating because finally, often for the first time in their conscious life, they are being themselves. The sense of emptiness begins to fill with genuine feeling. The exhaustion lifts as energy is no longer consumed by maintaining the adaptation. Life becomes vivid, immediate, real. But it is also terrifying because they are now vulnerable in ways they have not been since early childhood. They are showing their true self to the world, and there is the fear that it will be rejected, just as it was rejected originally. And indeed, some relationships and situations will not accept the authentic self. The person may lose relationships that were built on the false self, may find that people they thought were friends were actually only connected to the adaptation. This is painful but necessary. Relationships that require self-abandonment are not genuine relationships. The space that opens up when these relationships end creates the possibility for authentic connections. The reclamation of the true self also requires grieving what was lost, the years spent in adaptation, the experiences that were never had, the self that was never allowed to develop. This grief is profound. It is grief for the childhood that was not possible, for the parents who could not accept the authentic child, for the decades of living inauthentically. This grief must be felt and worked through. It cannot be bypassed or rationalized away. But on the other side of this grief is a kind of freedom. The person who has reclaimed their true self and integrated it with the necessary adaptations of adult life can move through the world with a groundedness and authenticity that was never before possible. They know who they are. They are no longer dependent on external validation for their sense of worth. They can be flexible and adaptive when the situation requires it, but they are not imprisoned by the adaptation. They can be themselves. As we near the end of this reflection, let me speak directly to those who recognize themselves in this description, who sense that they have been living from a false self constructed in childhood. First, understand that this was not your fault. You did what you needed to do to survive. The child you were had no choice but to adapt. The false self was a creative and necessary solution to an impossible situation. But you are no longer that child. You are an adult with agency, with the capacity to make different choices, with the possibility of living authentically. Second, understand that dismantling the false self is a process, not an event. It takes time to discover who you truly are beneath the adaptation. It takes courage to express the authentic self in a world that may not always accept it. It takes patience to develop aspects of yourself that have been dormant for decades. Do not expect this to happen quickly or easily, but also know that it is possible, that others have walked this path before you, that the true self is there waiting to be reclaimed. Third, seek support for this work. It is very difficult to do alone. Find a therapist or analyst who understands this process, who can provide a relationship where your authentic self can safely emerge. Find others who are doing similar work, who can witness and validate your journey. Do not try to do this in isolation. The false self was created in relationship, and it is healed in relationship. If this exploration has touched something deep within you, if you recognize the false self operating in your own life, I invite you to support this channel by liking this video and subscribing to Psyche Meaning. This work exists for those who are ready to question everything they thought they knew about themselves, who understand that the path to authenticity requires dismantling the adaptations that have defined them, who are willing to undertake the difficult work of reclaiming their true self. Your engagement helps this content reach others who are ready for this profound confrontation. And so we return to the beginning. The ego builds a false self to survive childhood, to maintain attachment to caregivers who cannot accept the true self, to navigate an environment that demands adaptation. This false self is necessary in childhood, but it becomes a prison in adulthood. It prevents authentic living, genuine connection, the experience of being truly oneself. The work of individuation requires recognizing the false self for what it is, exploring what lies beneath it, reclaiming the suppressed true self, and learning to live authentically despite the fear and vulnerability this entails. This is perhaps the most important work a person can do, because without it, we live someone else's life. We become who we were supposed to be rather than who we actually are. The true self waits in the shadow, patient and persistent, calling us home to ourselves. The question is only whether we will answer that call. The journey back to the true self is the journey of a lifetime, but it is the only journey worth taking.